Well, good day, my friends. Today we are in Las Vegas, Nevada, right off the strip, and I'm going to tell you about what was supposed to be here, how Howard Hughes was involved, and how Howard Hughes' greenhouse is still here. And actually 2 days ago they announced what's going to happen to it in the future. This is all exciting stuff. Daze with Jordan the Lion, you all, and some great Vegas history begins now. You know, before there was ever the lights and glamour of Vegas and Bugsy was just starting everything that would become what we would know, Howard Hughes was making his name all over the country, making movies, being, creating airplanes for the military, running TWA, just a very fascinating man for his time. And we're going to find out what it was about this greenhouse that brought Howard Hughes here. So you can actually see the greenhouse straight through their gates here, but I'm gonna go and see if maybe there's a chance they'll let me get a closer look. This whole area at one time was supposed to be developed into homes, was right off the strip, and eventually everything else turned into casinos and all that around it, but this house remained, and we're gonna see it on the KLS TV property. They were actually nice enough to let me on the premises to show you the greenhouse. This is called the greenhouse because it is a greenhouse, and it's the actual color that it would have been back in its day. So it's really crazy because this was, basically what had happened was Howard Hughes had inherited a massive family fortune from Hughes Tool Company, who his father had basically invented new ways of digging for oil. So if you can imagine being in Texas and selling oil tools, he became a very wealthy man, left it all to Howard. Howard was kind of said to have been very much his mother's son. And so it was always kind of thought that throughout his entire life, he was looking for kind of like a replacement for his mother, and would kind of revert into that into his years. So he found his way out to Hollywood and wanted to make movies to make his own thumbprint on the world, and he went out and immediately was having success. His movies were doing well, and he ended up deciding to make a movie with Jean Harlow called Hell's Angels, 1930. And that movie, in order to really make it authentic, he had to get a whole team of airplanes, and ended up deciding, after going through two directors, that he didn't like how they were doing it and that he was going to direct it himself. And that in order to do that properly, he would have to become a pilot in order to understand the raids that he was going to be filming, and also to participate, because that became a passion. Once he became a pilot, he became obsessed with it, and would eventually even go as far as to secretly become a pilot for just normal aviation companies, and would be caught later. But he was so successful, he did this, that he ended up eventually purchasing RKO, one of the big six studios, and also purchased TWA. And so he ended up also getting government contracts, and that became very, very topical because, he was a political guy. And one of the things about him was that even when he took over RKO, they said he shut down the studio for 6 months to examine all of the employees to make sure that he didn't have anybody that would lean or be known as communist, because he was just going to fire them if they were. So then he, becomes so famous and so influential that they find out that he was paying off people to get these government contracts. In fact, it was said FDR's son, he was supplying women to FDR's son to get them. So when he finally was able to get out of all that, then they found out that he wasn't paying personal income tax. He was paying his business income tax, but not personal. So he founded a charitable organization, put all of his companies into that, and that way they couldn't touch anything, but he actually would get everything on the back end. So he decided to move everything out here, and that's how he ended up at this house. He basically owned a lot of property all over Nevada and made a deal with the government that if they would give him one solid piece, and in return he would move Hughes aircraft out here, and this was part of the whole move out here. He would end up taking over this house. So now we're gonna get inside and look around. This is pretty amazing that we got behind what were once literally sealed doors. So this house, they have aerial views. I found an article that a local named Jeff Carlson wrote an article about this place and said that there were aerial views of the house going back to 1950, but that the records say that the house was completed in 51. So that tells you how far back it goes. Howard Hughes actually originally was leasing this house in 1953 when he moved here, the early 50s. And what it was some biographers said that he lived here solid for a year. But what they did, they tracked down some of the people that worked with him, and they said that actually what it was this was his office. This was his office for a solid year. It was actually Paul Wynn who said Hughes used the house as an office during the daytime when he was in Vegas in 1953 working. From there, he established the Howard Hughes Medical Institution. Hughes never watched any movies in the house, even though over here we see a TV and we see VCR. They said, Kay Glenn told me many times that Hughes never spent a night in the greenhouse. He maintained a suite at the Flamingo at this time. So he didn't actually live here, but he was here every day for a year. Now, what ended up happening was he actually described saying that this house was not at all like a house or even an office. He said it was actually furnished like a motel, and that eventually Howard just decided, he was in Vegas for years, eventually coming down with OCD, where he wouldn't leave the house or the apartment. He would stay on the 9th floor and would not bathe. He was losing weight. He was peeing in jars. He was doing all this crazy stuff, and eventually decided to leave Vegas. And they said that his orders were to seal up this house. So even though they didn't own the house, he told them to seal up the whole house, all the doors with wood and everything. And that's the way it stayed until he died. And I guess the family eventually, Hughes Corporation eventually bought the house off of who he was leasing it. And they kept it forever because once Howard died, they didn't know where his will was. And for a year they were looking for it. So they actually dug up the concrete floors here looking for the will and never found it. But what's cool is that one of the scenes, because this house is so authentic and so trapped in time, that one of the scenes in Casino, or where they used this actual room for Casino. You can see Sharon Stone in this picture right there. Right here in this very room. So how crazy. So eventually the property was sold with the television station and everything here, and they were cool enough to turn it into a museum. I'm not sure what the exact policy or how you would be able to tour it, but when I went to the front desk and asked, they were very nice about wanting to share the history of Howard Hughes. But what was crazy is I planned on wanting to come and see this for probably a year and a half. And 2 days before today, I just read that they secured funding to, I guess they're going to move this house to the Clark County Museum. And that will make it available to where other people will be able to see it in the future. And so they've decorated the whole place. And Howard Hughes, when he moved out here, he actually made a movie called Las Vegas. It was a very famous Jane Russell movie. So he made himself a staple of Vegas. And in fact, when the atomic testing was going off, it made him super paranoid. He hated it. He didn't like that kind of stuff. He said going on in his own backyard. So what's crazy is that they eventually, Paul Wynn, who said that this was used as an office and everything, and said that they were told to seal it up and whatnot, he said eventually they were sent back here, and they said, we opened it up and it was exactly the way it had been, the way we remembered it. They said it was furnished, but not like a regular house. It was furnished like a motel. There were towels in the house from Sun Villa, a nearby motel on Fulcher's property, who was the man they got the house from. And they said that had been gone by the 70s. They said they looked for the will. They couldn't find it. They said that they scanned the ground and everything, and it flagged something metal, but when they dug, they never found anything. So they eventually, it was used as part of the sale. Everything was sold together. There's Howard Hughes making movies. Very peculiar guy. I've heard stories that he was with a lot of starlets. They said, Paul Wynn said he never had any starlets here, but then they also said that Howard Hughes never slept with really any of the women either. It was just kind of like a thing. If he decided he liked them, he would pay them, and he would tell them they couldn't have any other social life. He would even hire private investigators to follow them around to know exactly what they were doing. Told them not to sleep with their bras on because it wasn't good for their chest. Crazy. The women of Howard Hughes, they have a display over here. It says, local legend refers to this space as the women's room for Hughes' female companions. The billionaire had a hard-earned reputation as a ladies' man. Hughes' biographer Jeff Schumacher compiled a list of at least 30 names of women who at some point had a relationship with Hughes, whether romantic or not. Now I'll tell you a story that I know firsthand. That's kind of cool, though, that they have all this stuff set up like this so you can kind of get an idea. Yeah, he was tied to Betty Davis and Vivian Lee and people like that. But the story I have was of my good friend Shelley Winters. She told me a great story I'll tell you about when I get outside. I love that the house is still green. I love that every room has a little display of something. Here it says, someone as private and secretive as Howard Hughes generated their fair share of myths and legends, especially in Las Vegas. Some of the stories as Melvin Dumour and Mormon Will inspired films and TV shows. Others deserve the label of bizarre, such as Hughes' Las Vegas Watergate connection. Yeah, so the story on that was that Howard Hughes was basically hiding out in his room all the time, like getting bed sores, losing weight, walking on paper towels, having people hand him things with tissues. And yet, when Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, Howard Hughes apparently hired everybody on Bobby's committee and cabinet and everything and tried to get them all into the presidency and tried to put his own guy in there. And so it was said that when Nixon, got busted for the Watergate investigation, it was that he had sent people looking for any kind of info on Howard Hughes and the Democratic Party, that he was tied to it. So they do have a part right here about that. And Howard Hughes, for like 20 years of his life, wouldn't ever be seen or heard from. He had a guy that became his assistant who was a former FBI guy, and that guy was basically his mouthpiece. And they apparently never ever met in the entire time he worked for him. And I guess the reason was that they finally, they said, had a 4-hour conversation one night. And the guy that worked for him, the assistant, was like, basically it came down to, in the end, he said, Howard Hughes said, if you saw how bad I've let myself go and how bad I've let myself deteriorate, you'd never be able to effectively represent me ever again in anything. So there's the outside of the house before it was on the property. It says no other structure from this period survived the strip. This is the only one. So it's kind of a little secret here. If you don't know it's here, you wouldn't know it's here, literally. So here's our little kitchen. That was so nice of the TV station to let me come and document this. because, you know, once it's moved, it could be changed or anything could happen. But I really feel like the TV station putting them as much love and commitment and everything that they've done into keeping it the way it is and actually making it a kind of a museum piece, I think they deserve a lot of credit. It's pretty amazing to see. Wow. And here they even have something on the wall over here about the will, that they thought the will was a hoax. Wow, another kitchen and the original linoleum. Look at that. Wow. Just crazy to think of. He wasn't always the OCD guy, but I guess after all the flights and the crashes, he had crashed so many times, that became a thing to where I found somebody that worked for him said it was crazy. You would have to put paper towels on the floor and he would walk barefoot, or you'd have to wrap the silverware in Kleenex, then put Kleenex under the Kleenex box as you pulled a piece of Kleenex to wrap around that piece. You would hand it to him. You go through all this, and yet in his room, in his penthouse room, the floors had never been vacuumed. It was filthy. So he said it was almost a major contradiction in his life. I totally planned on just doing the whole vlog through that fence and just thought, what's the harm in asking, because the building's going to be moved, and they were so nice. We actually got in the Howard Hughes greenhouse today. Okay, I teased you guys inside about my true life starlet story of Howard Hughes. Shelley Winters. Shelley Winters was at the time a budding starlet in Hollywood, and she had already married someone and he was off fighting in the war. So she goes to a party one night and she gets there a little bit late because I think she told me she was performing in a play, and she said she arrives late. Everybody had already ate, and she said she was starving. So they said, go ahead and help yourself to anything in the refrigerator. So she goes in the kitchen, and she said she's looking around for something, and a big tall guy wearing tennis shoes comes in and starts talking to her. And she said she could tell he was very shy, but she was just stuffing her face full of stuff, and he was laughing as she was talking to him and everything. And she said, we ended up talking for a while, and I was telling him, my husband's in the military, he's a hero, and this, and that I was an actress, and that I'm in this production over at Universal, and da-da-da-da. And she said they have a good time, and she said, I just thought he was, because he wore tennis shoes and he was tall. She said back in those days, men didn't wear tennis shoes out in public or at a party ever. And she said, so I thought he was a prop guy. I thought he was somebody who worked in the prop department and climbed ladders and stuff. So that's why he was dressed so comfortably. And she said, and then I walk out back to the party, and I forget who the actress was, came up to her and said, Shelley, why were you in talking to Howard Hughes? And she said, who? And they said, that's Howard Hughes. He's the biggest womanizer in town. He must have hit on you or something, right? And she said, no. I told him that my husband was in the military and that he's a hero. And he said that was amazing. He basically said, that's great, Shelley. I admire that. And she told me, she said he never, ever in her life hit on her. Anytime he told her, if you ever need anything, call me. She said anytime she needed anything, if she was in a production she didn't like and she thought that maybe he could help, she would call him and he would try and get her traded to his productions at RKO and things like that. So she loved him. She said he was a great guy. And when the movie Aviator came out, she actually didn't like it because to her, even though I thought Leonardo DiCaprio did a great job, to her, she said, Howard Hughes was a big hulking guy. He doesn't look that way to me. She just didn't feel like DiCaprio really embodied the Howard, the era that she knew. But it's crazy. Yeah, she had a story, but she said that was kind of a thing back then. She said a lot of men that were celebrities and things, they really didn't care if women were married. That wouldn't stop them. But if you were married and your husband was fighting in the war, that was a different story. They wouldn't touch you. And so she said he always respected her and that they were great friends all the way until Howard Hughes' death. So in the end, Howard, was less than 100 pounds and was just emaciated. And he was always terrified that people were trying to kill him or, just trying to do him in so they could take over his fortune. So they were flying him off for an emergency surgery, and he ended up dying in the air on the way. So that's how the legend of Howard Hughes ended. And then, like I said, then they had to come back, unseal. They had literally put plywood up all over the windows, all the doors, everything, and then literally sealed it with tape and everything so nobody would go in for all that time. And they opened it up after he died looking for his will. Well, my friends, that went better than I could have ever expected. I was, you know, when I found out about the greenhouse, couldn't wait to come back here and kind of share that history with you guys, and really never thought that anything would change. Couldn't believe that while I was here, they announced that they're gonna actually move it to the museum. So big shout out to the Clark County Guild, Clark County Museum Guild. You'll be able to go visit it there soon. And who knows, maybe they will find interior matchup photos, maybe able to do it exactly the way it was before, but looks pretty dang close now. Thank you to the good people here at Channel 8. Without them, we wouldn't have been in. That was awesome. Have a great night, everyone, and goodbye.